Good afternoon, everyone. It's August the 5th, 2026, and welcome back to our next conversation with the SPS team regarding their 2026 Integrated Resource Plan. This is Margie Tatro with GridWorks, joined by my GridWorks colleagues, Kathy Boyce and Deborah Shields. And we're happy to have everyone here, including a great team of subject matter experts from SPS and a number of our stakeholders who are here to learn more about the very deep and complex notion of modeling for informing the integrated resource plan. As you heard, we're recording this workshop so it can be available to those here and those who can't be here. And the recording and meeting materials, as usual, will be posted on the gridworks.org website after the workshop. So with that, let's share the next slide. You can see our objectives today are really to understand some more model results. The SPS team has been busy crunching numbers, and their computers have been working overtime to also support that number crunching. So just like our workshop a few weeks ago with some model results, we're continuing that conversation today with additional model results to date and ability to answer stakeholder questions and have conversations about those results. Of course, these model results are going to be instrumental to formulating the utility's statement of need, which we'll talk some more about. So to the extent that the modeling is revealing insights that the utility would like to share at this point, the opportunity for our conversation to go there. And finally, the last thing for today, we want to prepare stakeholders for their independent review of a draft statement of need and action plan, which will be distributed later this month. And so after our welcome, we'll turn it over to the SPS team to refresh the modeling tree that you've seen before and give some updates to model results. We'll spend the majority of today's workshop discussing results, and we will build in pauses and breaks as the topics present themselves. And I think that just like we had the previous workshop, it's great to pause after some critical topics and have conversation as we go along. So the next slide just reminds folks of our protocol and our workshop norms. We're going to ask the utility to start their presentation. Please hold your questions until we pause for questions. And when we do that, we'd ask you to state your name and organization clearly. There's two reasons for doing that. One, we test your audio and make sure we can hear you. Two, it helps everyone in the workshop know who's speaking and your affiliation. Continue to be respectful in comments and remember that we're all working with good intentions. Thank you for giving each other the benefit of the doubt and stating and offering your questions with very constructive and open perspectives. We're glad of that. Continue to share your ideas, and we do want to hear from everyone who's here in the workshop today. So the next slide just describes where we are in this process that began in March. We are now in workshop 6B. We broke up the modeling result conversations into two workshops because they are so detailed and involved. So this is the second one of the workshops to really dive into the detailed modeling. And so we will do that again today. And then in August, we will turn back to a big picture perspective and begin talking about the feedback that stakeholders will have on a draft statement of need and action plan that will be shared with stakeholders prior to the Carlsbad August 26th, 27th workshop. We're going to encourage people to attend that in person if they can. Please note that, as we mentioned at the previous workshop, the September 9th workshop has been canceled and changed to September 22nd. That will be a virtual workshop and the final workshop in the process. So this is the last really deep, detailed modeling conversation. So again, next in August 26th, we will turn toward big picture, what does it all mean conversations and how does it impact the integrated resource plan. Next, I'd like to ask Kathy to review kind of, I guess I do this one still. There were some things that were left over from workshop 6A. information that's been posted on iManage, and those who have requested access can see that there's data being added to that pretty regularly, a big chunk, I think, just yesterday and today. And then there was an action to present additional model results, and that is what's happening today. So, true to our process throughout this workshop series, we try to come back to things that were left open from the prior workshop and make sure they're closed out. So, with that, Kathy, let me turn it over to you if you wouldn't mind reminding folks of what motivates our work on the next slide and what we'll be looking for in the statement of need and action plan.
Sure. Thank you, Margie. Good afternoon, everybody. So as Margie referenced, today is really our last deep dive into modeling and the detailed analysis. And then we're going to start to pull back out to larger big picture questions. So in the coming weeks, we're going to return to that central question that we started with of what does SPS's resource need to meet the expected demand? And by regulation, stakeholder input is called for in three different areas. So the modeling that we're just been working on over the last several months, and then these two other areas, the statement of need and the action plan. And so that's where our attention is going to turn in the coming weeks. So on the next slide here, a little detail for you on statement of need and action plan, just to orient you of what this is about and what will be asked of you. These are prescribed in regulations. So there is very specific rule language to the utilities of what needs to be in the statement of need and what is the contents of the action plan. So what you see on the screen here is just the plain language reading of that, sort of our interpretation to simplify it a little bit. To help orient you. So, statement of need is to include a description of the new resources SPS needs to reliably meet customer demand and state policies. It should include the key technical characteristics for those resources. And a statement of need should take a broad view of the system beyond just peak demand, which was the metric that historically has been used for resource planning. And then on the action plan, by rule, again, the rule language is specific steps that the utility will take in the next, it's actually 3 years by rule. SPS is going to propose 4, and they'll walk you through the explanation here in just a minute. So for our purposes here, the specific steps over the next 4 years to meet the resource plan. And it's supposed to detail any contracting activities or competitive procurement and solicitations, and also give a status report, an update on items from the last action plan. In past action plan has generally been about a dozen or so items from all the utilities that we've worked with, just to kind of give you a sense of how lengthy or how many items might be on there. And then if you want to see the actual rule language or examples of what utilities have filed in the past, we've compiled this background reading for you. I'll drop it in the chat in just a minute, but if you want to go to the originating language itself, we'll provide that for you. And then just to frame the timeline again, if you go take a look at the box at the top there, the planning horizon rule calls for a 20-year planning window. So for this work, 2027 to 2047. And then the action plan for SPS, again, they're going to propose 4 years, and they'll explain the thinking there shortly, 2027 to 2030. So those are the immediate years that we're focused on for SPS to take actions. So with that, I think I'm going to hand it over to the SPS team to go ahead and take us into the modeling detail for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. 1 second, I'll share my screen. The button. All right, should be up now.
Yes. Good.
All right, 1 second. We are showing the presentation material?
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right, so I appreciate everybody jumping on the call today. A lot of good modeling work we've done, a lot of different scenarios, a lot of different views of futures for the SPS system. We're excited to show it to you. There's a couple of things that we wanted to start off with, though, that were a continuation of some questions that were asked last time. So we asked Dr. John Goodenough to join today. And he specifically wants to, answer some more questions and talk a little bit about load forecast. So, John, are we on here right now?
I am on. Can everybody hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Great. So appreciate the opportunity to talk a bit more about the forecast, in particular these stakeholder questions that came in after the last meeting, or I think maybe toward the end of the last meeting. I'll just go through them one by one. So how do we evaluate the likelihood of the large load requests? I will say that for specific projects that are being included in the planning forecast, they are projects that the company has deemed highly likely to connect. In general, the majority of them have some sort of signed agreement, so either an ESA or a transmission agreement or some sort of distribution level service agreement. There could be some exceptions to that, particularly for loads that we know have been delayed due to just the study process at SPP or our known ability to serve the load means that we need to shift it out. So they just haven't quite progressed to the point where they've signed one of those agreements, but we're confident, through conversations with customers that they will as soon as they're able to. And then another aspect where a load request might not have a specifically have a signed agreement is if it's a connection, a further ramp at an existing connection. So through conversations with the customers, we understand that they want to expand their presence at an existing connection. We'll potentially include that load in the forecast, even without an additional signed agreement. As far as so as I mentioned, the highly likely loads are what's included in the forecast. We do not discount the capacity, so we will be including the load request, the amount of load that is requested by the customer into the forecast with a ramp. So typically we'll ramp loads over about a year. So a 10 megawatt request requested today would hit 10 megawatts by August of next year. For the loads that we know are delayed by studies, we might kind of extend that ramp a little bit. So up to potentially 24 months. So the entire capacity of the request that we're including is included with some sort of ramp. The one thing that I will note is that both of what I've discussed so far only includes to the loads that are associated with specific projects. As I've discussed, there are also probabilistic loads that are included in the forecast. So those obviously won't necessarily have signed agreements at this point. We might not even know exactly what the request will look like at this point. We're just including an amount of load for the expectation that perhaps customers that have not yet progressed to that signed agreement eventually do, or we continue to get requests in the future that eventually become highly likely and do connect to the system. On the last question, are the data centers and oil and gas load requests treated differently? As far as everything I've discussed up to now, no, but there are different assumptions for the load associated with data centers versus oil and gas. Data centers tend to be higher load factor. Oil and gas load is quite high load factor, but data centers are even higher. And there's actually a bit more seasonality in the data center load, because a decent amount of load is associated with cooling. So you do see that load drop a bit more in the winter than we would see the oil and gas load drop during the winter time. Any additional thoughts or questions on that?
So John, while we have you, I see that Alex Palomino, you've joined us today, and I know you had some specific questions on load forecasting. I think there was some exchange of information between the two workshops. Let me give just Alex a chance to indicate whether his questions have been answered, or do we need to have the SPS team follow up with you outside of this workshop. Alex, could you comment on where you are in terms of your understanding or questions on this topic?
Yeah, hey, thanks, Margie. Thanks, John. Thanks, Justin. I appreciate you guys taking my email questions here at the top of the workshop. This was super helpful. I'm also working on the NVE IRP, and they have kind of an explicit like we like mitigate loads by such and such percent. So that's where some of those questions are coming from, because NVE basically says if you have an ESA, we assume on an aggregate level that approximately 70 or 80% of that load will materialize according to the ramp schedule. And if you don't have an ESA, then they reduce the load expectation by, 70 or 80%. So it kind of goes the other way. Either way, this was very helpful. And John, it sounds like as a matter of general principle, SPS is not taking sort of this like aggregate customer class, approach, at least for like known customers. You guys are really taking it customer by my customer and building those and into sort of the known large load pipeline. And then beyond that, there's the probabilistic loads. And I was trying to find my notes. It's going to take too long. But on the development of the probabilistic loads, my understanding is that there's like some work, SPS looks at historical large load performance and includes that in some kind of like distribution for probabilistic large loads. That's the part that's probably the most open to me still, but this was helpful.
That's great. I think you actually summarized that pretty well for a one sentence summary of a complex process. We look at historical large load growth and create distributions around that.
Okay.
For the probabilistic load. And yes, anything that's non-probabilistic is specific requests that we're evaluating whether or not to include into the forecast.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you for the questions, Alex, and the follow-up. So, Justin, then I think back to you.
All right, thanks, Margie. Do we have pause though? Any other questions from any other folks on load forecasting? All right. All right. We will jump back into the slide deck. So, Kathy quickly added this note earlier in the introduction, but as we get into the slide deck, one of the first things we wanted to make sure that we are communicating with the stakeholders is that, as the New Mexico's rule is written, it's trying to establish like a staggered schedule for the three different New Mexico utilities. PNM being in 2023, SPS was in 24, and EP in 2025, and then the cycle starts over. Now, we requested and received variances to file our 2023 IRP and our 26 IRP 1 year earlier each. So we were off schedule for both of those. We're trying to get back on that schedule though. So within this 26 IRP, we're going to be requesting a 4-year action plan. And the result of that will ultimately mean that the next IRP that we file would be in 2030. And that'll help us get back on that schedule. I just want to pause there, see if you have any questions, thoughts about that. But the intent here is to get us back on the staggered schedule.
Yeah, do stakeholders have any questions or comments about this proposal?
All right. I will go ahead and move on. Okay. All right. So we'll move on. And as always, one thing that we just caveat is, I think that Margie and Kathy mentioned, like, we have been modeling all the way up until this presentation is coming out. So, we're feeling pretty good and confident about these results that we're presenting here. But, if we find errors and things like that, we may have to respin models. These are, relying upon generic cost. So just making sure that we're caveating this, that the information in here could change, and ultimately any kind of future resource acquisition would be dependent upon firm pricing and availability of new resources. So that represents actual bids in the future. What we're modeling here is generics. So, things may change. I feel like we're getting to a pretty good spot here. I think that we have one run of all of our runs that have not completed at this point. So we will be providing at least one additional run after this meeting. But it's related to one of our forced and emerging tech scenarios. So just an FYI. So let's just real quickly go back to our modeling tree. Now, I feel like it's been we've gone through a lot of different meetings and a lot of different discussions here. Just to revisit, this was our original plan that we had laid out for our conceptual modeling tree, understanding the different load forecasts. We had identified 3 load forecasts: a unconstrained planning, constrained, and a load forecast. And those were going to be our 3 main sensitivities for load forecast. And as we move to the right, we plan on running sensitivities on both market interactions and things related to the Energy Transition Act, RPS, and sensitivities for data centers and fuel pricing. All those different things were planning to be run off the constrained planning. That was the original concept tree. Now, as we have gone forward, we've kind of moved that into this IRP modeling mind map. And part of the reason is to be a little bit more visual representation of how the groupings of things can be compared against each other. And the other component is to expand the modeling to be responsive to stakeholders' requests. Specifically, and I'm not so sure. Let me see. Hey, I got a laser pointer here. Great. This is the first time I've been presenting in Zoom, so bear with me if I mess anything up. But load forecast scenarios. One of the things that we added that we had not originally planned was a low emerging tech and an RPS split scenario of that load forecast. So that was, to remind folks, our RPS split scenario is when we're solving a least cost portfolio first, and then we look at the thermal resources or the carbon emitting resources on the portfolio, and we load ratio share those to the different jurisdictions. And for thermals or carbon emitting resources that would have normally been considered a New Mexico load ratio share, we would remove those and allow the model to reselect resources that are non-carbon emitting. So we have an entire section based upon our RPS scenarios over here, based upon our planning forecast. But these 2 requests were added to be responsive to stakeholders' requests of understanding those scenarios in a low forecast environment. Additionally, some other sensitivities that we have added or either modified because of stakeholder discussions are around our market scenarios. To remind folks, originally we were talking about just doing an islanded scenario where SPS, who participates in the Southwest Power Pool RTO, what would it look like to remove a market connection into SPP and to operate as an island, but maintain its requirements related to seasonal PRM requirements and ELCC accreditations and things like that. This was meant to originally be a kind of preview of a 2028 requirement that SPS has for a cost benefit analysis related to participation in the Southwest Power Pool. When we had conversations with stakeholders, many of the folks that are on this call, we also added this scenario here where we have an islanded scenario, but we adjust the PRM in the winter to be the summer PRM. So we would maintain, for simplicity, that the data today is 16% PRM in the summer. We would maintain that 16% in the winter as well. Just to give folks a background, today that PRM for winter is 36, so it would be a reduction of 20% on the PRM in winter, but we would maintain the ELCC accreditation for that was still seasonal. So both summer and winter ELCC curves, but just a single 16% PRM year round. So that scenario was added. We also have all the scenarios related to our existing resource changes, our data centers, and most of our RPS scenarios were identified from the beginning. However, you will notice that there's a section over here that we've kind of carved out saying system-wide carbon zero. We'll get into a broader discussion quickly in this call today, but to remind folks, in our last meeting that we had in late July, we were talking about our RPS split scenarios and what it looks like at 2045 and what are the carbon emissions on the system and what could be attributed to each jurisdiction at 2045 given our modeling setup to model a 2045 RPS requirement. A lot of discussion happened around that. Basically, and we'll revisit some of this, that the RPS scenario that we had envisioned as our RPS split to get to that 2045 requirement still showed carbon emissions of around 2 million pounds in 2045 annually that could still be contributing or could be attributed to the New Mexico load ratio share. So one of the things that we took back from that conversation is let's model what it would look like to have a system-wide carbon zero requirement. That we know for sure that modeling a system-wide carbon zero requirement at 2045 would get the carbon emissions down for the New Mexico load ratio share. So we'll have some broader conversations about exactly how and why those scenarios were there, but ultimately this does represent a modeling of 2045 requirements specific to New Mexico on SPS's multi-jurisdictional system. So this would be enforcing requirements across both jurisdictions. So you can see that most everything on this slide is green. Green means that we have both got capacity expansions, the initial capacity expansion modeling, and our 8760 production cost scenarios for the 20-year planning horizon. So you're also going to notice that they're down here in the bottom right, we have an orangish yellow color. That is our one scenario that has not finished its production cost run to this point. So we look to finish that and we'll provide that after the presentation. I just want to check, does everybody, they do see my laser pointer, right? I don't have to actually press a button or anything like that, right?
No, we can see it, Justin. Looks great.
Okay, all right, just making sure. Okay, so we will move on. So to remind folks, we've presented these slides for a while now in the same general pattern where once you get the slide decks, and you may have already grabbed it from the GridWorks website, we'll provide an updated version with our modeling runs that we completed today. But there's basically three groupings of slides, what we call our nameplate edition slides. That shows the nameplate edition of the different resource types through the different periods of the 20-year planning horizon through these different scenarios. And then we have a section where we call our NPV slides, and those are those same groupings, but we talk about the economic differences on the net present value and some other common characteristics among those runs in tabular form. And then once we move from those two groupings of slides, those are our general summary slides, we have an entire set of slides that's dedicated to each individual run, where we're showing both basic assumptions of what went into the model, the load forecasted associated with them, the net present values, the nameplate additions through the planning horizons, and also views of the accredited capacity in both the seasons. So we will not be reviewing every single slide in the presentation, but we're providing it just so that you have that information in hand when you take it back, and as you were digesting the information and getting prepared for that August or that late August meeting in Carlsbad to discuss the statement of need. We wanted you to have all the information in a single presentation to be able to focus your thoughts on. So
Justin, before you start presenting the nameplate additions, let's just do a quick pause with people back to the slide on the mind map to see if there are any questions for folks about the scope of what's being modeled, what has been adjusted over the past month. Are there any questions about the content here? Because as Justin mentioned, there are several bubbles that were added as a result of conversations and interests by stakeholders. So are there any questions about the scope of what is being modeled to inform the IRP?
ExxonMobil, can you hear me?
Yes, James, please go ahead. Please
Hey, good.
introduce yourself.
Yeah, James Wood, ExxonMobil. Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, just this whole 1 gigawatt New Mexico carbon-free model run. Did we talk before, or can you remind me how exactly would that be sort of paid for? Is that going to be put in the rate base and socialized, or is this a specific tariff for the data center for 1 gigawatt of carbon-free power that other rate payers would obviously not be accountable to have to pay for? Like, how does it merge together? It's still not clear to me how that would work.
So I will say that we're not talking about cost allocation at all in any of these scenarios. This is purely like a resource planning activity where we're taking load forecasts and different assumptions and modeling out resources. Now, it doesn't necessarily attribute which customers or who would be responsible for paying what, either in the emerging tech scenarios or the RPS scenarios or the data center scenarios.
I see. So it's just basically a need that is potentially being identified. You're going to model to provide for it, and the cost
Yes.
allocation and how it's paid for and the tariff is all going to be done through sort of standard rate-based conversation at the commission.
Yes, I mean, we're definitely not speaking anything about proposed tariffs, large load tariffs, microgrid tariffs, any of those kind of conversations. I know those may be happening in different avenues, but that is not the focus of the conversations in the IRP plan.
Yeah, no, I understand, but the cost of providing for specialized customers that want 1 gigawatt of carbon-free power, that is part of the scope of the conversation. But I recognize that the allocation part is going to come later. So that's great. Thanks for answering the question.
Yeah, and thanks for the question. And I just want to make sure that for the data center scenario specifically, what we did for the data center scenario is we just developed a hypothetical 1 gigawatt data center. And this is just uh, it's completely agnostic of where that that data center would be located, or it is a generic assumption of a load ramp. It's a generic assumption of timing. It really is just meant to be representative of the types of resources that could meet a data center. And we decided to do a 1 gigawatt carbon-free scenario and a 1 gigawatt all tech kind of scenario where we can
Right.
see, with different restrictions, or I'm sorry, with different kinds of constraints, what could a hypothetical data center be serviced by? So there is no actual data center behind this modeling. It is just meant to be representative of something that could serve one of those types of loads.
That's great. That's very helpful. Thanks very much.
Great, thanks, James. Justin, I don't see any other hands up or audio for questions here, so thanks for pausing here. This is a really important piece of the context. So I wanted to give folks a chance to ask questions if they had them, but I think you're ready to go on.
All right. Thank you so much. Okay, so we'll go through some of the general information of these groupings, some general takeaways, and then we can talk about some more specifics as we move through the presentation material. Now, the first grouping that we'll talk about are the load forecast. Now, um, we've had some conversations about what is this difference between our constrained planning forecast and our unconstrained planning forecast. And specifically with those two, there's a lot of discussion about timing of when load comes on and the ability of those resources to come on at that same amount of time. So that's why you see such difference between the constrained base and unconstrained on the additions by 2032. A lot of that has to do with the potential for production tax credits to be available in this time period. And if that load is there and you are able to service it with resources, it makes sense to be able to service it with renewables that are going to be tax advantaged. We also have our load forecast, our low load forecast. All three of these scenarios, though, which you'll notice is that, and I probably should have explained this real quick. Let me pause for a second to orient people who may not have seen this information before. We have four groupings of graphics. The Y horizon is maintained through all of them. And what we're trying to show is the additional resources before 2032, between the time horizon of 2033 to 2040 and 2041 to 47. Those are all incremental additions during those time periods. And then when you get to the right, you see a cumulative addition for the 20-year planning horizon. So on the right is the cumulative amount of each one of the three load graphics to the left of it. Now, importantly, what you'll see is that all three of these scenarios, regardless of the forecast, is showing a fairly diverse mix of resources. Now, we'll get to the slide where we're talking about net present value differences between these different scenarios. And I always caution folks when you are looking at that, if you're seeing a lower NPV for a low forecast, that doesn't necessarily mean that it is a cheaper plan. It just means that the underlying load which you are serving is less. So your resource need is less. And then therefore your revenue requirements that you need to service that load is less. So it can be a little misleading when you are comparing net present values between different plans with different forecast levels. All right, so I will jump to the next slide. And now we are on our gas price sensitivities. So what we did here is we took our forecasts for gas pricing and market energy, and we had our base scenario, and then what we did is a 50% up and a 50% low to give us a high and low forecast. Now, this should be fairly intuitive. What you would assume is that in a future with higher gas prices, you would assume the model to select resources that limited its exposure to fuel pricing. And in instances where you are modeling a lower gas price future, the model would select more thermal generation to be able to leverage that lower gas price. And that generally is what we are seeing in the total additions result. The high gas price scenario does select more renewables to offset fuel pricing, and low gas pricing selects more thermal resources to take advantage of that. And then you have a base scenario that lies in the middle of those two scenarios. Oops, sorry about that. I just hit a button. One second. Oh, I'm so sorry. One second. Oh, what did I do here? Give me 1 second. Let me see if I can get this shared again.
Yeah, thanks, Justin. We lost the screen share.
Oh, you did? Okay, that's why I was like, why is the buttons not working anymore?
Yeah, we don't see your slides.
1 second.
Yes, you're back with the slides. Yep.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's not let me share them as a presentation mode though. 1 second.
Okay.
Let me try closing that back out and doing that again.
Okay.
Okay, I think I'm about ready. All right, are we back?
Yes, we're sharing the full slide view. Yep. You're
All right, sorry about that.
perfect.
Okay. I'll tell you what, you press the wrong button, you don't necessarily know what happens. Okay. All right. So apologize for that. Next slide that we're going to look at here is the nameplate additions for what we're calling our islanded scenarios. Now, to remind folks, what we have here is a basin and islanded. Now you're going to see over here on the right hand side, the basin and islanded use the same capacity expansion. That's because that the original intent of our island scenario was just going to be a production costing run, where we are maintaining the portfolio requirements to solve for the same PRM requirements, utilizing the same ELCC curves, and was just modeling the markets off in the production costing. So you would not expect a change in the capacity expansion. Now, to the right of that, though, this is our additional stakeholder requested run, where we modified the PRM requirement only to be a 16% and maintain a single PRM throughout the entire year. And you can see it's slightly different. And by slightly different, some of the detail probably gets lost in here. We do have some slides, for the individual runs that show a waterfall chart of exactly what resources change. What I can tell you here is that in general, what we saw was that the model selected less CCs and less solar and selected more wind to be able to solve the scenario. And we'll discuss a little bit more of those ramifications in a little bit. Now, we have a summary slide of what we're calling our existing resource replacements. And I won't spend too much time on this because you can tell most of these are very similar. In fact, one of the reasons that they are so similar is that the change cases that we're showing here are very small. So we ran some scenarios where we have Quake County being replaced by CTs, Quake County being replaced by a long duration storage, or some of the Cunningham units 3 and 4 being replaced by fuel cells. So the amount of resource changes that we're requiring here are very small, so you're not going to see a lot of large deltas between the overall builds in these different modeling runs. Now we get to the data center scenarios. Now we'll talk a little bit exactly about the parameters around these scenarios a little bit. In general, what we saw is that the overall nameplate additions for the New Mexico data center were larger than the Texas data center, which is utilizing thermal resources. Both of these are going to be incremental to base merging tech scenarios. Nothing particularly interesting to show on these nameplate addition slides, though, but we'll get to some more information later. Things start getting a little bit more interesting in our graphics when we start talking about RPS and carbon zero scenarios. So what we have here is 4 scenarios with varying levels of assumptions here. So to remind folks, our base plus emerging tech, that is our scenario, that is our least cost solution. It is our cheapest portfolio that we developed, and it is agnostic to any system or to any state-specific requirements. It is just a least cost portfolio to meet customer needs across both jurisdictions. To the right of that, you're going to see an RPS 2045. My laser pointer back out. An RPS 2045 scenario. And that RPS 2045 scenario is the exact same thing as the base emerging tech, except we enforce a constraint on the model for only the New Mexico load ratio share to represent the RPS requirement of 50% 2030 renewable energy credits, 80% 2040. And then the way we modeled these initial scenarios was 100% 100% renewable energy requirement in 2045. The next scenario we have here is what we call our RPS 2045 incremental, which is the base emerging tech scenario being developed first and then enforcing an RPS requirement on top. So everything in this scenario, RPS 2045 incremental, is incremental to the base emerging tech. So everything inside of this build here is also in here, plus additional renewables and batteries. And then our final scenario that we're showing on this graphic is what we call our RPS 2045 split scenario. And this is our approach that we had developed that we previously described, where we take the base emerging tech, we load ratio share carbon emitting resources, we remove the New Mexico load ratio share of carbon emitting resources, and then lock the model and allow the model to respin for carbon free resources to meet our requirements. You can see that they're, in general, what we saw, except for our incremental load, is we see less carbon emitting resources, but still enough carbon emitting resources that Texas load ratio share is maintained, and then increasing amounts of wind, solar, and battery storage. And specifically, you can notice an increase in long duration storage being selected as compared to our base emerging tech scenarios. And feel free to pause me on any one of these slides. We have a lot of slides to go through, but we're open to having dialogue as we're going through these slides. All right. Now we have our scenario, what we're calling our incremental resources. Our emerging tech resources. So all of these we are comparing back to our RPS 2045 split. So on the graphic that we were just showing, this is the last column, and now it's the first column here. So what are we modeling here? We modeled 3 scenarios here, and you're going to notice that you see this hydrogen CT scenario. That's because we do have the capacity expansion runs, so we're able to show this information here as a capacity expansion, but we don't have the production costing information behind it right now. So in these scenarios, what we did was we allowed, we have the base emerging tech scenarios, our least cost portfolio. We remove the New Mexico load ratio shares of the emitting resources, and then we require a generic hydrogen build out, or a generic geothermal build out, or a generic nuclear build out, and then we optimize the portfolio around that to get to our RPS requirement goals. So there's not a lot of information to really think about here on these scenarios. Basically, you're going to see the exact same thermal resources, carbon emitting resources between all scenarios. You'll see varying levels of wind, solar, and battery storage as these other technologies are incorporated. All right. Now, this is a slide that is brand new to most or to everybody on this call. So in response to some of the conversations we had last time, these build outs are assuming a system-wide carbon-free scenario at 2045. So these are all enforcing RPS constraints through 2044, and at 2045 we require carbon zero. Now, because this is a system-wide approach, we did not utilize the RPS split scenario because that assumes that we're maintaining carbon resources on the system. That would be load ratio shared to Texas. Now, in these scenarios, where's the button at? Why am I not seeing the button? Okay. In these scenarios, this is a system-wide approach. So you still are seeing thermals built, but the focus is that we are requiring the RPS on just the New Mexico load ratio share in the base build and not doing a 2-step solution. So we did run 2 different variations of this, one being a carbon-free where emerging tech was allowed to be selectable. So that meant that that nuclear was selectable, geothermal was selectable, long duration storage was selectable, hydrogen CTs were selectable, in addition to our normal suite of resources, generic resources that we have in the model. And then we had a scenario where it was basically existing technologies today, so no emerging tech available. You can see that the carbon-free scenario where emerging tech is allowed, on the total additions, you're going to see that the model is natively selecting nuclear and hydrogen CTs, and 100-hour duration batteries. In a scenario where we do not have emerging tech, the model had to select enormous amounts of wind, solar, and battery storage. In fact, if you will notice, these graphics look a little bit different than this one, partly because the y-axis we had to change. So originally, this is our y-axis. We're talking about this. This is right here. This represents 30,000 megawatts. Now, when you move over to this scenario, we're approaching 80,000 megawatts in this scenario. So what we're kind of showing here is that in the absence of emerging tech becoming more economical or becoming available, existing resources today requires a substantial build out. And we'll talk a little bit more about this when we get to our net present value slides and our individual run slides. But I'll pause here for just a second because I know this is the first time that we've shown this, and I see a hand come up. So
Yeah, Chelsea, please introduce yourself and go ahead with your question.
Thanks. This is Chelsea O'Tang with Energy Futures Group. I guess I'm just a little surprised for the carbon free with no emerging tech that you didn't see a switch over in terms of the 4-hour storage getting saturated in from an ELCC perspective and switching over to the model selecting 6 and 8-hour storage. So I just wanted to confirm that we're still in the result that you shared last time we talked, that 6 and 8-hour storage is not getting selected.
6 and 8 hours are not getting selected. I will go back and we'll talk to the modeling team and get some confirmation on that. But yeah, we can get some confirmation on that. But I'm not under the impression that 6 and 8-hour batteries were selectable in these. Or I'm sorry, excuse me, I misspoke. I'm under the assumption that 6 and 8-hour batteries were selectable in these runs.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I don't see any at this time. Alex, please go ahead.
Thanks, Justin. Just for me to track all the scenarios, this RPS 2445, as distinct from the split scenario, this RPS 2045 kind of optimizes for carbon free in New Mexico on sort of like a one-shot modeling run instead of like locking Texas and then re-optimize it. Is that correct?
Might rephrase it a little bit differently, but it does not do a two-stage scenario like what we were talking about with the RPS split. It does require the New Mexico load ratio share to be meeting the RPS standard all the way through 2044. At 2045, it is a system-wide carbon-free. So not just in New Mexico carbon-free, but a system-wide carbon-free. And we'll talk a little bit about why that is. Part of this is a continuation of the conversation we had last time with our RPS split scenario, where we were still able to attribute around 2 million pounds of CO2 to the New Mexico system in that scenario. So we were looking at alternative ways to model to be able to reduce the amount of carbon emissions that could be attributed to the New Mexico system. And we'll show a slide in here in a little bit. It's kind of a heat map of hours in which we're seeing the New Mexico system relying on thermal generation.
Okay, thanks.
Does that answer your question, Alex?
Yeah.
All right. Any other questions? All right.
See any hands up, Justin, so please continue.
Thank you. Yeah, and the last grouping of our nameplate slides is the low load forecast. Remarkably similar trends to what we were already showing in our planning scenarios as well. In general, it's a smaller build, of course, but what we generally see is a diverse mix of resources. When we model an RPS split system, we are still seeing things like the 100 hour long duration storage coming in. So although it's a smaller build, it still represents a like kind build where we're still seeing thermal generation being selected, both CCs and CTs. Um, Large builds outs of wind and solar storage and long duration storage coming in when we start modeling in the RPS requirement. Any questions on our low scenario? I think this might be one of the first times that we've shown this one as well. All right. Margie, should we take a break or should we jump into our NPV comparison slides?
How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. I think that once we get started on the NPV comparison slides, it'll probably last about the same amount of time as this last section did.
Okay, well, let's probably a good idea on a warm afternoon to take a 10-minute break, Justin, and then jump into the NPV and the resiliency reliability, the EUE numbers after that as well. That's probably another good hour for those two. So let's go ahead and take I show 158 at the moment, Mountain Time. And so let's resume at 2:08, 10 minutes from now. Feel free to grab a drink of water, compose any additional questions, and let's take a 10-minute break. Welcome back, everyone. Give a minute. Justin, are you back online and available to continue sharing those slides?
Yes, ma'am. 1 second.
Great.
Just give me 1 second. All right.
Looks great.
Okay. It's got this weird window floating. Okay. All right. So back into the presentation material. We're going to be talking about just the the summary of the net present value comparisons for all the different scenarios that we just previously showed. So all the same groupings that we saw will be the same groupings that you see here, but we'll talk about a little bit more of this tabular data, kind of what we're seeing here, and then we can start getting into some of any of the individual um, slides that people might be interested in. So. Right. Okay, so on this very first one here, we have the summary NPV comparisons for the load forecast. Like I said before, it's a little misleading to be looking and comparing the net present values between these different ones because there are the net present values based upon the revenue requirements of the resources, not necessarily, and it's agnostic to what the load is underlying. It's just what are the costs of the revenue requirements of this portfolio. So I wouldn't focus too much about what the cost deltas are between these ones. Um, but we're presenting that material so that you have it. The next ones we have are the gas price scenarios here. Generally, not much to see here and fairly well in line. We expect to, we see it in situations where we have higher gas prices that overall the cost of the portfolio is more expensive by about $1.28 billion. And in the low forecast, it's significantly cheaper by 1.59. So, but roughly in line with the general increases on the gas energy prices that we are implementing in these different scenarios.
Justin, would you take a minute to explain the rows in this graph? So
Yes, ma'am.
we'll see several in this format.
Yes, ma'am. So, and some of these will differ a little bit when we get into some specific runs, but in general, what we're showing here is the net present value of the revenue requirements of the portfolios through 2047, the 20-year planning horizon. Then underneath that, we have a general description of what the scenario is. Then we have an assumption of whether emergent tech is available in the scenario or not. Um, and then we have a line item here for EUE, which is the expected unserved energy within the portfolio. Underneath that, we have on here a capacity payment. So that is, we do allow the model to make a selection of a capacity payment of what currently is the 2x of the cone. And to let folks know what that means, a capacity payment in this instance would be roughly equivalent to what today's deficiency payment would be on Southwest Power Pool. So to participate in the Southwest Power Pool, every load responsible entity is required to bring enough resources to meet both its native load, in addition, a planned reserve margin on top of that. If you do not bring enough resources to accredited resource megawatts to meet that, then you would have to pay a capacity deficiency payment. And that is done twice a year, both for a winter season and a summer season. Now, to determine that deficiency payment, they utilize what they call CONE, which is the cost of new entry, and it's tied to an F-class CT. That deficiency payment, however, it does have an escalator or a multiplier to it, depending upon the overall capacity position of the entire market. So in situations where the market is deficient as a whole, that multiplier can approach 2 times what the cone is. And that's on a kW per year basis. So in the model, what we've allowed the model to do is to make a potential capacity purchase in foregoing a resource selection for a specific year or so. So that's what we're seeing on that capacity penalty or capacity payment line item right there. Now, the line item below that is curtailment, and that is going to become a much more important conversation, I think, when we start getting to our RPS scenarios and what those mean. Curtailment is the amount of megawatt hours that are not able to be utilized by the system in our model. So if you have a wind resource or a solar resource and it's generating megawatt hours according to its production profile, and the system is not able to utilize those megawatt hours to service native load or to be able to sell to the market, that could be potentially lost as curtailment in the model. Down here below, you can also see that we have some information about capacity, payment cost assumptions, and expected unserved energy. These are assumptions that we use in the modeling. It is not necessarily reflective of actuals. In fact, on the capacity payment, the Southwest Power Pool currently has a revision request to their tariff out now that would actually calculate the cone every year, but they would do it on a 3-year planning cycle, and for every 3 years it would be completely recalculated, and then the next 2 years it would be utilizing the Handy-Whitman index to escalate those costs per year. So what we are modeling here is just a flat 279.70 kW per year deficiency payment. That number is expected to increase over time now if that revision request goes through, which every indication at this point is that it would. Margie, was Was it that get at your question?
Thank you. Thank you, Justin. Yes. I think so people are aware of what's on the full composition of these slides. I think that's important. So thank you for doing that.
Thank you. Okay. So on our next scenario here, we have our islanded scenarios. So what we saw here is that the net present value does increase pretty dramatically for these different scenarios. In the islanded with the summer PRM, we're seeing about $22 billion increase to the portfolio. Um, you know, an important thing there is that a lot of that delta is being captured as, or is being passed through as EUE. So you can see on the line item EUE, we're seeing 18.3 million megawatt hours of expected unserved energy. That represents megawatt hours that the model did not have enough megawatt hours to service our load. And that, we put that as a penalty of $2,000 per megawatt hours, or $2,000 per megawatt hour as a cost assumption for that. So these represent portfolios that are not reliable. Now, the NPV is being influenced by that reliability. So we're trying to convert that reliability metric into an economic metric to be able to make a comparison between these scenarios. Now we'll move on unless we have more questions. All right. So this is our NPV comparisons of our existing resource replacements. Folks, remember we showed those slides on the nameplate additions. Very little difference between the nameplate additions. There's also very little difference between the net present value comparisons as well. Specific call out on the Quay. We did two different scenarios, one where we're replacing Quay with a CT, and then one where we're replacing Quay with a long duration storage. Now, in the modeling, the long duration storage did show slightly more expensive, but I would argue with the information with generics and things that we have, that this amount of difference between these two scenarios is probably is very small. So I don't know that you could say, with this information that for sure you would go with either one of these technologies. I think that it indicates that there are multiple ways to solve that situation. Yes, Chelsea.
Thanks. In the base case, is the Quay replacement a 4-hour battery?
I'll have to go back and look at it. I'm not. So I think that in our base case, we don't enforce a selection of a resource at that location, right? So it's not. It's just solving in these specific scenarios where we're replacing Quay specifically, and the other one we're just letting the model solve for the overall system-wide capacity. And I don't remember if there was, if we have something going specifically in Quay County or not. I'd have to check with our modeling team and get back with you.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? All right. Now we'll get to our data center scenarios. Similar kind of conversation here. Both of these data centers are the exact same data centers. The only difference is one requiring zero carbon resources and one requiring or one not requiring any specific technology. So all source and then zero carbon. What we're seeing is very similar NPVs, although being solved differently. And we can go to those individual files or those individual slides for these different scenarios to see what the actual resource deltas are between them. In general, the nameplate for the New Mexico data center is larger, but with different resources than the Texas data center. But roughly comparative on the NPV comparisons. Takeaway here is that there are lots of ways to solve this. with different technologies, I think that it could be very site specific. What kind of resources ultimately come to solve a data center. In the modeling that we've done with generic assumptions trying to solve this incremental load, what we did try to do was make a comparison back to the base emerging tech scenario and remove the incremental revenue requirements that were selected for the resources to service that load and look at the existing system and how it changes its operations and what can be gleaned from the existing system impacts. Just roughly with the system-wide level of information we're looking at. Now, we have a $50.52 billion in the net present value for the base, and then we have $55 billion for the data center. Roughly of that 4.6 billion, we're talking about a very small amount of change to the existing system in the generic modeling that we're showing here. So basically, in these scenarios, the model is selecting enough incremental resources to service both its capacity requirement and its energy requirements with the incremental resources. So the existing system in this modeling activity is maintaining fairly stable in its operations as compared to the base emerging tech. I'll pause there and see if there's any questions. Yes, Alex.
Thanks, Justin. I don't know. I think and I may misunderstand some niceties of the New Mexico and Texas data center scenarios, but I guess on a surface level, did y'all expect a greater spread in NPV when considering zero carbon resources and all resource options?
I don't know that I had an expectation on this. I think that's I think that it can be dependent upon lots of different things, but planning horizon assumptions, I'm sorry, the timing horizons, the load ramps, things like that. I think that when we start talking about individual data centers, they're impactful on a system wide, but they are still discrete loads. And so generic modeling, I feel like, is only going to get you so far. And one very important thing that we're not really considering here is the potential for transmission constraints on the system, right? So to remind everybody, like the modeling that we've done here is it's through Encompass, and it's a zonal representation of the system. It's not a nodal representation where we're looking at actual LMP prices across different nodes. So, I do think that when you start talking about a specific data center and trying to model it on the transmission system and understanding exact and providing geographical context to both the resources and the load and the expectation of firm service to those loads, especially given the context of Southwest Power Pools, Hilga processes, these numbers could be different. So I think that as a generic representation, what we're saying here is that it is possible to model scenarios that are fairly similar and are able to service those loads and be both energy and capacity adequate, but that is not taking into reality the specific constraints around a specific data center. Does that answer your question, Alex?
Yeah, it's a complicated problem. I
It's
understand. Yeah.
yeah, it is a complicated problem. Yes, Chelsea.
Thanks. I'm sorry. I think I might be misunderstanding the row for the existing system impact costs. Are you trying to say with those numbers that like show the change in what's happening on the existing system in terms of like potentially existing resources are operating more, so you might have higher fuel or variable costs for those units when you add the data center load, or am I still misunderstanding what that represents?
No, I think that you are hearing that. I think that's exactly what I'm saying in
Okay.
in the zonal representation of the model. Now, it could very well be that existing resources may have different changes to operations once we start taking into that actual transmission topology that would affect, and so, I think it is important to take the next step and understand when these things actually are coming onto the system for both the load side and the resource side, that you know, understanding of firm service and transmission constraints across the system can be influential on these scenarios. But on a zonal representation of the model is selected, and with generic resources, um, those generic resources are able to match the capacity and energy requirements, um, even with these two different, technology requirements.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? All right.
I just have a quick maybe correction. If you can go back to your sheet.
Sorry,
You've
sorry.
got
Right, Orland,
Yeah,
will you please
Orland. This
introduce
is
yourself?
this is Orland Whitney with the New Mexico Public Regulation Commission. Um, on your expected unserved energy row, you've got 464 megawatt hours.
Mm-hmm.
Then at the bottom there, you say expected unserved energy cost assumption $2,000 per megawatt hour.
Is our math off?
You're looking at 928K, not 615 there.
Yeah, I apologize for that. We'll go back and look at it. We'll get it corrected before we send it out. Sorry about that, Orland. Any other questions? All right. So jumping into our NPV comparisons for our RPS scenarios. And so these, we've already talked a little bit about these on the nameplate editions, but what is the actual cost deltas between these two? So in these scenarios, just to remind folks that this RPS 2045 is optimizing with it as a base assumption of the modeling. This one is modeling RPS as incremental to our base and emerging tech. So it is strictly incremental to our base emerging tech scenario. I forgot my laser pointer. So yeah, this incremental scenario right here is literally incremental requirements on top of this scenario. And then the RPS 2045 split is where we load ratio share the carbon emitting resources and re-optimize for carbon-free resources on the New Mexico load ratio share. Now, there are some cost deltas. What I would say is the most important one right now is that on this incremental one, you're seeing about $2.35 billion increase when you are looking at RPS as a strictly incremental cost to the system. So if you are strictly maintaining the resources in the base emerging tech scenario and then adding incremental renewables and batteries, you are going to see an incremental cost. That makes intuitive sense, but that's what we're seeing in the modeling as well. Obviously, the RPS split scenario, it removes that overbuild and gets it back down. Now, on the cost delta. Now, in all these scenarios, we did have emerging tech available, EUE, and I apologize if there's any miscalculation on some of these numbers. I haven't looked at those on the EUE road, but
This is Orland again. I think I was actually incorrect. I think you're correct with the cone factor. So I think that's good.
okay. Sorry about that. I'm not able to do the math in my head while I'm doing the presentation. So if it was right and I
You're
didn't
fine.
mention,
I think it was correct. So yeah, no,
okay,
I was incorrect there.
okay. Okay, so the EUE, there is some EUE in some of these scenarios, not that impactful. Neither is capacity payment in my opinion here. I do think what we started to talk about though is the curtailment, right? So in our base scenario, what we're seeing is about 341 gigawatt hours of uh, curtailment. And then we see substantially more curtailment when we start implementing the RPS requirement. Now, this really does represent an overbuild of resources to effectuate that RPS requirement. Specifically, the RPS requirement that is renewable energy credit additions. So the 50%, the 80%, all the way through 2044 is really driving up some of the curtailment by over selecting renewable resources. We'll get a little bit further in the presentation. We'll have another conversation about that in a little bit. Now, this is our forced and emerging tech scenario. We have some highlights where it's yellow. That, as I previously said, we didn't get the production cost runs completed before this presentation, so we will be updating and providing the modeling, as well as the an update of the presentation material here. Now, the base comparison to all these scenarios is our RPS 2045 split. All of these force-ins are really done after we are locking in those Texas resources and we're re-optimizing the New Mexico load ratio share, and we're including these different technologies in the build-outs. Some interesting kind of things that we're seeing, obviously, like here, what we're seeing on this the split nuclear side, it's showing to be cheaper. I would caution with that. Is heavily dependent upon our assumptions that we have in the model. It's also, not necessarily contemplating potential impacts of permitting periods and things like that. But it does indicate that emerging technologies that are carbon-free could potentially be a better move towards just incremental renewables and battery storage. So the way I would take this information out is that just similar to what we've talked about on our base emerging tech scenarios, is that in the future, the model is always saying that there is a need for firm dispatchable capacity. And trying to solve for a biphasal requirement of an RPS requirement transition to carbon zero creates some inefficiencies on a build out that is targeting two different goals and then changing those goals within a single year. All right, I'll pause there, see if there's any questions. All right. Now we get to move to some of our more exciting modeling runs, interesting modeling runs that we've since done as a response to our conversations last time. In these scenarios, one thing I just want to make sure that we're cautioning folks on is that in these split scenarios, we're always comparing back to RPS split. Now, in the next grouping of scenarios where we're modeling system-wide carbon, we're modeling it against our RPS 2045 scenario, not the RPS 2045 split. And the reason that is because we're looking at this on a system-wide basis and trying to make a comparison of what we would do on a system-wide perspective. To remind folks, the RPS 2045, it is requiring RPS on the New Mexico load ratio share in the base build. Now, what we have here on the RPS 2045 scenario with system-wide carbon-free, this scenario does allow emerging tech, and we do see things like nuclear getting selected, hydrogen CTs getting selected at an incremental cost of $3.86 billion. Other metrics that we are seeing, though, that are interesting is the expected unserved energy. It does increase by an order of magnitude when we start going towards a system-wide carbon-free scenario, whether we are allowing emerging tech or not. It does represent an increase in expected unserved energy. And we have some graphics that kind of summarize both curtailment and EUE in a couple slides. Very interesting here on the last row of the curtailment. The RPS 2045, RPS system-wide carbon 2045 scenarios are both showing about the same level of curtailment, um, as well as similar levels of curtailment that we saw on our other RPS split scenarios. However, when we go to a system-wide carbon-free where we are not allowing emerging tech, so the model is not able to select things like nuclear or hydrogen CTs or geothermal, we see it significantly building renewable resources and heavily curtailing them. Now, the important thing about the curtailment in our model is that it's not really contemplated or being captured in the NPV. So the way that the curtailment, the way the model is working is that it has the generation that's associated with these resources for wind and solar, and whatever generation the model or that is being generated on the system and being utilized by the system, the cost of that generation is being attributed to the revenue requirements in the model. However, the curtailment doesn't do that. So these costs are actually even higher when you consider the cost of curtailment that is not being captured in the model right now. Any questions before we move on? All right. Okay, this is our last kind of summary NPV slide. So we'll start showing some other more visually diverse slides. Maybe it's probably is a little bit dense on the variations between the slides. The last slide we have here is the low load forecast. So this is in response to stakeholder requests about understanding what our assumptions are for a low forecast, incorporating both emerging tech as well as the RPS scenarios. And like we previously talked about, the results are not surprising. It's a overall smaller net present value of the revenue requirements in these scenarios. And once we start adding the RPS constraint, similar to our other scenarios we've shown, we do see an increase in cost of those scenarios, as well as an increase in curtailment risk for the scenarios. All right, any questions on our low load forecast? All right, and Margie, it looks like I was wrong. I thought I would last the same amount of time as the last grouping of slides, but I guess I went through these a little bit faster.
No, no problem, Justin. And we've had a couple of stakeholders joined us a bit into the presentation this afternoon. And I'm wondering if before you go into the EUE comparison, you would mind please skipping back to the mind map
Okay.
and just reflecting again what you commented on earlier about the changes that were made to the modeling scenarios that you've been conducting as a result of stakeholder input. Because I know we've had a few folks that joined us after you discussed that. Yeah. Could you just give a executive review of those things that have changed? Because some of the stakeholders that have joined us a little later may be appreciating what has changed.
Yes, ma'am. Okay. So just to do a quick review, what you're seeing on this slide, if you see green, it means that it's been completed with both capacity expansion and a production cost run. We still owe folks a production cost run here. That is the last bit of modeling I think that we have left to do. Now, what has changed since our original plan for modeling is a number of things in these different groupings. So just to orient folks, the IRP modeling, this central one that represents our constrained planning model. A lot of our scenarios kind of branch off from here, and you should really be thinking about these different blue areas as like groupings of slides, right? So the the load forecast scenarios, the existing resource changes, gas sensitivities, market scenarios, RPS, all those are what we generally consider groupings of information that you can make comparisons against within those groups. I don't advise people to make comparisons across load forecasts to different scenarios. So I wouldn't make a lot of comparisons of like a low load forecast here, comparing it to a high gas price on our planning forecast. The underlying forecasts are different, and it would lead you to the wrong conclusion about what is the appropriate portfolio by just making a comparison that doesn't make sense. However, if you're within a group, it makes perfect sense to make a comparison between a high gas price sensitivity and a low gas price sensitivity, or back to its base. Now, when you have these RPS split scenarios, it makes a lot of sense to be comparing that RPS scenario to these four SINs that have the same base understandings or base assumptions with changes to that upper level scenario. Now, what has changed is, and we'll start from the left, is this low emerging tech and RPS split on the low forecast. Those are additions that we made in response to stakeholder engagements. We were not originally expecting to model those. Additionally, in the market scenarios, we had originally just identified one scenario where we were just modeling mainly a markets off approach on production costing, where we did not allow the Southwest Power Pool to the market to, or for, excuse me, we did not allow SPS to participate in the Southwest Power Pool market. So it was an islanded approach from the greater RTO. The scenario we added in response to stakeholder engagement was the islanded use summer PRM for winter. So this was a scenario where we removed that market connection and then required a single PRM year round of 16%. But we maintain the seasonal accreditation of resources during those scenarios. Additionally, the other scenarios that we've added is the system-wide resources, and we were probably discussing that when some of the folks joined. But the system-wide carbon zero is in response to the conversations we had in our last meeting when we were discussing our RPS split scenarios, and the RPS split scenario having identified around 2 million pounds of CO2 emissions in 2045 that could still be attributed to New Mexico load in that scenario. So these scenarios were meant to target a true carbon zero system to align with the requirements. Margie, did I hit it all?
Perfect. Thank you, Justin. I think it just helps to keep folks track of what's this complicated set of scenarios. So thank you so much for doing that.
Yeah, no worries. All right. So we're going to do a flash through here real quick, and then we'll jump into some other unique slides. So EUE comparisons. So this shows some of our scenarios that have some of the higher levels of EUE and what those overall impacts were. We've had a conversation previously about some of these things. The changes here being the RPS system-wide carbon scenarios. So in general, these larger impacts to EUE, those are really focused on our islanded scenarios where we really are demonstrating that the SPP market, although it doesn't have a capacity contribution to SPS, it does have an expected amount of energy that does help with reliability of the system. Now, what you also can see is that the RPS 2045 scenario system-wide carbon-free, what we see, and you can see that with the red colors here, the blue colors here, we start seeing those kinds of EUE popping in just right around 2045. So I'll go ahead and move on unless we have any questions about EUE. All right. Now we'll talk about curtailment risk. And you can see that curtailment risk. Interestingly, here you see this scenario right here. That's our unconstrained planning forecast. And if folks remember, earlier today we were having a conversation about, well, the constrained and unconstrained planning forecasts. The main difference there is a timing conversation where we are expecting the load to come on sooner and we have resources that are able to service that load. And what the model is showing is that you would select the renewables because of capturing resources that are taking advantage of the PTCs. What that is also showing us, though, is that it does potentially increase curtailment risk when you are selecting resources to capture those PTC value. Now, minor point, a much larger point to be made here, though, is looking at what the annual curtailment is really starting at the 2044, 2045 data points, where RPS really makes a transition between a renewable energy credit requirement of 80% in the 2040s to a carbon zero requirement at 2045. And obviously, one of the things we've been talking about is the system-wide carbon scenario with no emerging tech. So not assuming any kind of major advancements in emerging technology and basically servicing that requirement with just incremental amounts of wind, solar, and battery storage. And the amount of curtailment and the amount of over selection of renewable resources is significant to be able to solve that need. In other scenarios where we're modeling RPS 2045, we still see a significant impact of curtailment risk associated with higher levels of renewable penetration. The high gas scenario, you can see it's not necessarily our highest curtailment risk, but in a world where we are selecting renewable energies to avoid higher gas prices, over time, you're going to see an increasing amount of curtailment risk to avoid that. A higher amount of renewables to avoid the gas pricing and an increase in risk in curtailment. All of these other scenarios are really showing an indication that that step change requirement between REC generation and carbon zero does have a significant impact to increasing curtailment risk. I'll pause there and see if there's any questions.
Yes, please go ahead, Chelsea.
Thanks. I am failing to remember your assumption, but there is a limit on how much the new resources can export to the SPP market, right? And that's what's part of what's leading to this curtailment risk that you've identified in the scenarios.
There is a limit on market interaction that is represented in our model as a transmission constraint. So it's not specific to renewables, but it is a transmission constraint. So any kind of energy,
Okay. Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that I definitely think it's good to contextualize this risk, but it's so far into the future that we also don't know what that will look like, right? Because that's in your model that's staying the same. And so if there is potential expansion there for that exchange with SPP, that might cut into some of this curtailment that's happening.
Yeah, agreed. I do think that there's a little bit of probably a recursive relationship. If you had an increasing amount of renewables on the system and you were studying that with enough foresight, that potentially might increase, transmission connections to the SPP market as a whole. I would say though that like the important thing for me here, and Chris, I see your hand up, so I'll pause in a second, but is that it is a step change, right? That it's that the triggering event here is a renewable energy credit requirement being converted to a carbon zero requirement. And it's not necessarily the transmission constraint that's driving this. It's uh, the changes in policy requirements.
No, definitely understand that. I was just providing the comment that we don't know. We also don't know what that future might look like, and so there's definitely takeaways from this, but we also don't know what that assumption might look like, and what impact that could potentially have since it is so far out, and we don't know what that would look like. So just wanted to provide that. Thanks.
Yes, thanks, Chelsea. One thing that would be, interesting, uh, is that we did not do a scenario where we enforce a carbon-free system on a islanded system. So that would be even more interesting, or that would be another interesting perspective to look at, is if you don't have a place to sell into a market, what would that do for your curtailment risk?
Yeah, I think you might start seeing a different and a more significant difference in the battery storage that would get selected potentially.
Mm-hmm.
Might pick up more of the 100-hour.
Yeah, that would be an interesting perspective. Chris, I apologize. I appreciate you being patient. How can we help you today?
So Chris, could you please introduce yourself and your organization? Thanks.
Absolutely. Yes, Chris Leger with the Interwest Energy Alliance, and I apologize I missed the first hour or so of the meeting, so I'm just trying to catch up now. But I appreciate Chelsea bringing up the transmission constraint issue. It's my understanding that there is a planned 750 kV line from SPS to the larger SPP that is in the planning stages. And my first question is that step up in transmission capacity included in the model? And if not, why not? And is my memory correct?
It's been a little bit since I've reviewed transmission topology. I will say that we do have a 765 line in the model in the 2030s that is really interior to SPS. I do think that we have some changes to our modeling topology that goes towards the SPP system, but I'm almost certain that it's not incorporating a 765 line to the SPP market. We might have to get back with you, Chris, on the specific changes in topology, and what the planning expectations are on that kind of connection.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I guess if there is any difference between what the model's including and what the SPP transmission planning is, trying to coordinate them, I think would be beneficial. So, I don't know if that's the case here or not.
Mm-hmm. All right. Any other questions or comments? Okay. All right. So now we're in our this the area of our slides where we won't necessarily go through everything. These are the individual runs, and things like that. I'm actually going to stop sharing just for a second so you guys don't have to just see your screen flash a bunch and while I'm navigating to specific slides. Um,
Justin, while you're doing that, let's ask the stakeholders, are there any particular runs that they're interested in specifically seeing those capacity, the waterfall charts and the specific additions of resources? Is there anything, I know there's a couple things you want to highlight for folks, and we'll get to those, Justin, but let's also just take a pause and see if there's any stakeholder on the phone that has a particular scenario that you want to dig into that Justin has provided summaries for. Let's feel free to put that into the chat while Justin is sharing some insights that their team has come up with. And just wanted to give an opportunity for people if they have a particular interest in a specific set of runs. We'll please put that into the chat or raise your hand while Justin is highlighting some things that they wanted to share with us. Does that make sense, Justin, for us to see if people want specific things? Okay, but I don't see anything yet. So yeah, why don't you skip to whatever you wanted to share first, and we'll keep you appraised if there's topics that raise up. Amanda, I think has, go ahead, Amanda.
Yeah, I just wanted, I think one that I'd be interested in digging into a little tiny bit more is just that islanded scenario with the summer PRM, given the difference in the unserved energy with that PRM alteration compared to the other islanded case. At least that's what it looked like in the EUE graph that you had. So I imagine it's related to what the model is building when it doesn't have a much higher winter PRM. But it'd be interesting to see the kind of difference in capacity between those two cases with that PRM adjustment.
Great.
Yeah, let's jump to that real quick. I can table some of my information until we get that pulled up. Give me 1 second.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Amanda.
All right. I'm gonna share my screen again. And if you guys don't mind, I might just share it like this, so it might be a little bit easier for me to bounce around. I know it's a little bit kind of like wonky seeing all the other stuff on PowerPoint, but is it okay that we share it like this? It can focus.
Yeah, I think that's big enough, Justin. We might ask you to review the legend so people can associate the color with a resource type.
Yes, we can do that. All right, so on this island scenario, that was our original one. It's going to have the exact same build out because it was just really in production costing run. But it gives us a good understanding of how to read the graphic here. So the red line, the bottom red line, that's going to be the native load. And then the red line above that is going to be the PRM, the reserve margin requirement. Now, the graphical colors, what you can look at here is the darker, more saturated color is going to be the existing resources. The less saturated color is going to be future generic resources that don't exist today. Good example here is looking at the blue. This dark blue right here, that represents CTs. The light blue right here, that represents future generic CTs. Interestingly enough, the yellow, you're not going to see a less saturated version of that color because that's our existing steam generation, and we don't plan to build generic steam generation in the future. So that grouping of resources goes away around the 2045 timeframe. The dark brown, that represents existing solar on the system today. And then the lighter brown here, or I guess more of a tan color, is a generic solar in the future. Dark brown here is existing wind on the system today, and the lighter brown here is generic wind in the future. Dark blue, batteries. Light blue is generic batteries in the future. So going to your specific question around that summer PRM requirement for the winter. This is the waterfall chart, and you should have access to all this material on GridWorks. So if we miss something, if you want to go back and look at it or make a comparison and review it while I'm talking, please feel free to do that. We can come back to it. But this is the waterfall chart that shows the incremental differences between the base case for the comparison and how resources change in response to these new requirements. So in the instance where we enforce a 16% PRM in summer instead of the 36% requirement today, what we would expect to see by the end of the planning horizon is 1.2 gigawatts more of wind and less solar, and then slightly less batteries and less gas CCs. Um, so overall, it does build less resources, but not on a total nameplate basis as much as you might think. It's about 600 megawatts less. But it does change the resource types that are built, to your point. And doing that and losing that firm dispatchable capacity specifically with the batteries and the gas CCs, we do see an impact um, with unserved energy.
Hey, Justin, the only issue with this view is the far right is cut off.
Oh, is it? Okay,
Uh,
I can change it.
we see LDI, long duration energy storage, but it cuts that label off in half, and I don't know if there is a contribution to that in that column, but it does. I At least I was having trouble seeing that final
Sorry about that.
column.
How about this?
Yes, that's great.
Okay, sorry about that. Was there any more questions about that? I think Ms. Levine, or if I mispronounced that, I apologize.
No, that was really helpful. Thank you. Yeah, just good to kind of understand what's changing.
Okay. Yeah, and all of our scenario slides that we have, if we have this islanded summer PRM, we have, when you pull up the presentation, you're going to see the exact same slides for every scenario. You're going to see a, uh, first off, the nameplate, and then you're going to see, that's not right. Yeah, is that right? Oh, yeah. Then you're going to, okay, sorry about that. You're going to see this waterfall chart on what the differences are, and then you're going to see the accredited capacity on both the summer and winter looks. And this one you're seeing winter right here. I'm sorry, you're seeing summer right here, and then you're seeing winter right here.
So wait, just to make sure, in the later years, in this case, for example, where it looks like it's not meeting the PRM requirement, it is getting that is where it is facing a penalty for not meeting the PRM, or
No,
something else.
yeah, sorry about that. So on these scenarios, the PRM requirement is our PRM requirement today, right? But the in the model, it's solving for a 16% PRM. But all of the graphics maintain the PRM numbers so that as you're flipping through the graphics, you can see what's staying the same and how things are changing above it and below it. But you can see here, it is satisfying the PRM requirement. But this number right here represents a 36% PRM requirement. But the model is not solving towards a 36%. It's solving towards a 16%. So there's no deficiency payment specifically for not being the 36% PRM. Now, it may pay a penalty for not being the 16% PRM, but this is just a representation of our requirements and not necessarily like the model's PRM requirement.
For that, clarifying that.
Yeah, no worries. Any other questions while I get to another slide?
I don't see any other topics people want to focus on at this point. They're in the chat. Kathy, I don't know if you see anything else. So Justin, I think you should continue with the summaries and that you wanted to share with the group.
Okay. I really want to continue our conversation about the carbon zero and RPS requirements. So I had a member of our team put together this graphic here. I think it's a pretty interesting graphic. I think it's very informative. There's definitely a couple of line items in here that I want to point you to because I think it's important. So what we're seeing here is we're utilizing that RPS 2045 scenario. So the same scenario that all the carbon zero scenarios are basically able to be compared to and utilize as a base comparison. Now, what we did here is we utilize the more granular production cost data on an hourly basis here. And we calculated the hourly ratio of megawatt hours from zero carbon resources, um, from carbon emitting resources or market, which has an unknown carbon content, and compared that to the ratio of or the load ratio share of New Mexico customers in each hour. So really kind of understanding, you know, what hourly is being dispatched to be able to service the load. Um, and what you can see here is basically we get a heat map on an hourly basis for each one of the months. So it's 24 hours, and we're providing each of the monthly data here, and showing folks exactly when the model is utilizing carbon emitting resources to service New Mexico load. Uh, the really interesting sentence I think here is that the Encompass RPS model uses a 100% REC requirement in 2045, which solutions this out on an annual basis instead of an hourly basis. And this is really, really important, is understanding that the carbon zero changes how we look at the model. When you talk about a REC requirement before 2045, you're talking about a volumetric requirement over like an annual period. But a carbon zero requirement, a true carbon zero requirement, requires a much more granular focus on the hourly dispatch, not necessarily the annual view. So when we look at this RPS 2045 scenario, what we are seeing is that a lot of the thermal generation that is needed to support New Mexico is really geared on the morning hours and also in the evening hours. But specifically calling out the month of August, this really reddish area here, that is between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. when our solar capacity factors are at 0%. And we're also seeing, as we are modeling in time and we're talking about battery technologies being incorporated in the system, we start seeing much more of a duck curve where we see like a morning peak and an evening peak. And we're seeing the capacity factors at their lowest during these periods of time. So, at some point, the batteries have to be charged to help mitigate those morning and afternoon peaks. And what we're seeing is that it really does impact the morning hours when uh, we're unable to service all of the hours of load is these off peak times in the morning. So this is kind of the problem we are trying to solve when we try to look at a carbon zero future. I'll pause there, see if there's any questions before I go to another slide.
Yeah, Justin, I have one first, just a content slide. Question. The numbers in this heat map are representing what? Tons of carbon, pounds of carbon. What are the numbers? I see the colors are the most intense numbers, but what do they represent in terms of a physical parameter?
Yeah, so these are gigawatt hours.
Those are gigawatt hours. Okay, thank you. Other questions folks have?
All right. Let me get back and see if I can find another slide here. There's just so many. All right, so what I'd like to do now is revisit, excuse me, revisit a set of slides that we had previously shared, and then talk about the individual system-wide carbon slides that we have. So just everybody I think has seen this slide. This is our modeling approach for the RPS split scenarios. And originally, when we were looking at this, we were trying to, build a base portfolio that was a least cost solution, and then replace thermals that can be attributed to Mexico's load ratio share, remove those, and then re-optimize on a carbon-free technology. Now, once we did that, we presented this slide last time. And this represents a portfolio that is more expensive than the base emerging tech by about $600 million. It also is not capturing the cost of the additional curtailment that would increase that delta on net present value. But what we are still seeing is that there are around 2 million pounds of carbon emissions that could still be contributed to New Mexico load in this modeling approach. So our original RPS split scenarios, what we were showing here, and that's this dark red, is this is the New Mexico or carbon emissions attributable to New Mexico load, and the gray is the Texas emissions attributable to, or I'm sorry, yeah, emissions attributable to Texas load. Now you're going to see this red hatched area. I'm sorry, I apologize. I put that graphic right on top of that. But the red hashed area, if you were to utilize that red hash area, that would represent our least cost portfolio, our base emerging tech. And so going from the red hatch to the dark red represents incorporating the RPS requirement, as we had discussed. Now, when you look at 2045, and as you can tell by that graphic, trying to solve all those hours of the 24-hour period throughout the year, there is a certain amount of carbon emissions that are happening on an hourly basis. And what we've found is that in these RPS scenarios, there is still a volume of carbon emissions above what could just be attributed to Texas load, even though we are limiting on a nameplate basis, the total amount of thermal resources on the system to just Texas load ratio share. So those same resources those generic resources of the futures that are being maintained for the Texas load ratio share are being utilized to help be energy adequate for New Mexico every hour of the year. So that's where we left it last time. I'm going to move over to the next slide, but I'll pause just for a second, see if anybody had any questions. All right. So this is what happens when we enforce the carbon zero requirement on our RPS scenario. So this requires us to incorporate the RPS needs or the RPS requirements and carbon zero requirements on the system and trying to maintain it just for the New Mexico customers. You can obviously see that we get rid of that 2 million tons, or sorry, 2 million pounds, and it does add other resources like emerging tech and things like that, and it becomes about $3.3 billion more expensive. This is what that scenario looks like. And you really do see that stepwise change in carbon emissions, from that carbon zero requirement. But this is that $3.3 billion one where we are allowing emerging tech to come in. I don't have a graphic today that shows the exact same scenario with no emerging tech, but it should basically be about the same representation. It's just going to be about $15 billion on a net present value difference. So I'll pause there and see if there's any questions, and then I will pull up the individual runs so people can see what those resource additions look like that are resulting from these runs. All right. So I'm going to stop sharing. I'll see if I can get to those slides real quick. Okay, I'm going to share my screen again. All right, so the first one that we'll show here is the fully carbon zero, and it allows emerging tech. So this is what that resource addition looks like. Substantial amount of wind and solar. But what I think is really interesting here is that uh, there is wind and solar resources being added at 2045, but a substantial amount of those wind and solar resources are already being selected prior to 2045. And we are seeing increases in curtailment of these types of resources past 2045. So it does represent an over procurement of these variable energy resources, in addition to selecting these firm capacity resources that you can see here at the top. You see, as compared to our base emerging tech scenario, substantially larger build out of battery storage, both long duration and short duration, and increasing amounts of nuclear generation and hydrogen. And this is the cheap version of solving that with emerging tech. So there's a lot of assumptions on where emerging tech is going to be going that are, there's a certain amount of level of uncertainty associated with those assumptions. Yes, Karen, I see there, Sean.
Yeah, I guess I'm just asking.
Sorry, Kara, could you introduce yourself and your organization, please?
Hi, my name's Kara Lynch. I work as an attorney for Coalition for Clean, Affordable Energy. I'm doing a color coding exercise. Is the um, bar at 2045? That's like lavender colored?
This one right here.
No, below.
This one right here.
Yep, down.
Oh,
Right there.
okay.
Is that generic solar or generic gas?
Generic wind.
Okay, thank you.
All right. So just real quickly, we'll all this information folks have access to on Great Works website. We'll quickly just show this real quick. I want to show the accredited capacity, winter capacity, and then we'll jump over to that non-emerging text scenario. But yeah, you can see that there's a reduction in the gas CTs and gas CCs, wind, solar, battery, all increasing, long duration storage, hydrogen, nuclear resources coming in. All right. So now this is the summer accredited capacity position. Now, this is what I kind of think is really interesting here, is that you really are seeing like the need for like CTs and things like that. The new CTs are like, it's gone. But what is interesting to me is that you're still substantially building over the PRM requirement, right? So the constraining requirement here no longer becomes the amount of capacity resources to reliably service the need. It's the need to find carbon-free resources in a sufficient volume to meet the energy adequacy requirements past 2045. I'll show that on a winter basis too. All right, and then if there's no questions here, I'll jump over to the emerging or the non-emerging tech version of this run. All right. Okay, so to remind folks, not everybody on this call was here earlier. Really importantly, just real quickly, we try to maintain our y-axis the same on all of our graphics. However, this next scenario that we're going to show you required us to change it. So you're going to see 35,000 megawatts. That's like the ceiling we had on most of our graphics here. Now, when we go to this fully carbon zero, no emerging tech, what we see is 80,000 megawatts. So, a substantial build out. And so it's going to be very difficult to kind of, keep an apples to apples comparison if you're just pulling up graphics together. So, I mean, we do have the modeling results that are out there. If folks need to see that, see the actual numbers or anything like that, or if you guys want to send a message to GridWorks or to Linda from Xcel Energy, we can provide some other information. But you're going to see like these red lines down here for the CCs or the blue lines for the CTs. They all are the same amounts. These darker colors are the same amounts that we've shown in all the other graphics, but they're just so much smaller. So just be careful when you're making comparisons that you are keeping in mind that the y-axis is changing here. But you can see that at 2045 we start seeing a very significant build out of both renewable resources and short duration storage resources in these non-emerging tech scenarios. We also see increasing amounts of EUE and also of curtailment. So when we go to our deltas here, you can see the significant buildouts that we're seeing on the different resource types to get to that carbon zero. And then this is on the accredited capacity basis, that you really see it very apparent that the PRM or that the amount of resources needed are exceeding the PRM. And I'll pause there, see if there's any questions. I think I see Chelsea.
Chelsea.
Just let you know, I think you, okay. I was just gonna say, I think your team chat was up.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
It's okay. I just didn't know if you knew. In order for the last scenario that we were just looking at, in order to make sure that you could build enough, did you essentially just have to remove all build limits on storage, solar, and wind? Because I think several meetings ago, you guys had presented your build limits. And so did you just basically have to pull those out of the model and make everything unconstrained?
I do think we had to remove some constraints. I can't remember if we had to remove every single thing. I'll have to get back with you, Chelsea.
Okay.
So Justin, let me ask, are there other specific takeaways you wanted to explore, or would you like to take a 10-minute break and come back and kind of give us, I know many of these results are very fresh and very, still the team is processing all of this, but I'm wondering if we take a short break, come back, and unless there's other things you want to dive into, you could maybe share with the group things that surprised you or things that you're taking away so far from this. Let me just ask where else you would like to go with the group today.
Yes, I think that's, unless people just want to go individually to the slides, I think I'm at a stopping point on when I'm ready to present today. I would be more than happy to take a 10-minute break and we can come back and see if anybody has some questions or thoughts now that they've had a chance to digest the material. And we can talk about next steps and get in preparation for that August or late August 27th or
Yeah,
Carlsbad.
we'll be in Carlsbad on the 26th and 27th,
Yeah.
and there's some intermediate steps that'll happen before then, but I don't want to shortchange the conversation here on interpreting model results. So just let's do that. Let's take a 10-minute break, give people a chance to think about if there's something you want to dig more into here today, questions you have that you'd like to ask, or maybe perhaps if you need more time to process material, we can factor that in. But let's take a 10-minute break and then let's come back and talk about what's next. So I show 3:25 p.m. Mountain Time. Let's resume at 3:35 p.m. Mountain Time. We'll see you back then.
All right, Margie, are we coming back?
Yes. Yeah, welcome back, everyone. I think at this point we should ask if there's any questions about the modeling results that Justin and team have presented to date, recognizing that it's both complex and very fresh for both stakeholders, and the utility team is obviously still getting numbers off the computer and digesting those at this point. So let's ask if there are any questions that people have, and then we'll talk about what's going to happen next in the process as the utility interprets and gains insights from all the modeling results, and how then that will be translated into the statement of need and action plan and shared with stakeholders. But first, let's see if there are any questions from folks who are on the call that you might have. I see we do have a question. Yeah, please go ahead, Chris.
Thank you. Chris Leger with InterWest. Justin, I just want to start out by saying I really appreciate the addition of the new scenarios that have been really helpful for me. So appreciate the work. I know it's a lot of work to do a lot of these additional scenarios. One of the things, I don't know if this is really a fully formed question in my mind yet. So I just am wondering, because when I look at a lot of these scenarios, a lot of the real differences are in the out years. And that's the basis of my question, which is there a way, and this is basically saying, is there a way for you to do more work? Is there a way for you to present some information comparing these scenarios in the resource acquisition period, or, some time period nearer than the 20 years? I think the 20-year NPV is a really good, useful metric for comparison, but there's going to be quite a few planning processes between now and then. So, we all agree that these IRPs are iterative and change. And so what are actually the near-term decisions that are going to be made, and how can we compare them? Is there a difference between these scenarios that is so significant, or are they all very similar in the near term? That's a comparison on a shorter term basis, I think would be really helpful to me.
Chris, I appreciate the question and definitely appreciate the kind words about being responsive to the requests and things like that. I'm glad that the modeling is meeting your needs. I agree with you I think that a lot of what you're asking for is probably going to be something that we need to be talking about when in developing that statement of need, towards the end of this month. I also agree with you that, like what are those overarching, like how does the near term differentiate itself between these different scenarios? And, you know, in general, what I see, no matter if it's a low load forecast or if it's an unconstrained planning forecast or constrained planning forecast or an assumption about RPS or not, what I can see is that the system generally in the near term still recommends a diverse set of resources. Um, it is still showing that there's a need for firm dispatchable capacity to serve customers today. It's still showing that there's value for renewables today. It's also showing increasing needs for uh, grid balancing resources like long duration. And most interesting for me has been the long duration storage. Like that's something that is coming to the model natively and showing that, given the right circumstances, that could be a beneficial resource type in the near term. You know, so I do think that we've done a lot of modeling, and it's a lot of the focus has been on trying to make sure that the modeling is right, that we're reviewing it, that we're QA/QCing it, and we'll spend the next period of time, next couple of weeks, on trying to understand and digest what it's telling us to kind of bring our perspective what that statement of need is. But I agree with you. The most important thing today is how do these different plans in the aggregate tell us what we need to be making in the near term decision timescale.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate that.
And so, Chris, let me follow up on that. Obviously, it's important for the utility to make these near-term decisions that affect particularly the resource acquisition period. Do you, Chris, have some thoughts about what your experience would provide in terms of those kinds of metrics for comparison in the resource acquisition period? Do you have some ideas of things that should be thought about?
I would say that we generally try to advocate for what we call least regrets sort of outcomes. So if the certain if certain near-term decisions are really positive in some scenarios, but really negative in others, I think those need to be really considered more significantly than those decisions that seem to be positive in, the vast majority of scenarios. So I guess my recommendation would be to try to find a scenario and the near-term decisions that fit that scenario that keep more options open longer. That is the least regrets type of idea that I think most people kind of agree with, that, especially when you're talking about out year emerging tech or not. We can't know that right now. But if we keep our options open such that there's the opportunity to take advantage of them if they present themselves, that's a win for planning in general, in my opinion. So I don't know if that really answered a question. I just think it's trying to keep options open, and the decisions you do make work in the widest range of available futures.
No, that's helpful for me. But Justin, do you want to reflect or comment on that?
It's an excellent comment. I agree with you. That's, there are a number of things that can be solution today, making sure that you're not precluding yourself from making a decision or precluding yourself from making a future better decision is a good idea. I think that, in some of our those two different carbon zero futures where we show emerging tech coming in and emerging tech not being available. And it's definitely saying that if there is a need for a type or characteristics that today look like CCs and CTs. In the future, it could look like hydrogen, or it could look like geothermal, or it could look like nuclear. It doesn't have to be those technologies today, or it doesn't have to be those technologies um, per se, but something with those same characteristics, that firm dispatchability, and making sure that we are not putting ourselves in a situation where we can't take advantage of emerging tech in the future. But it does indicate that there is a value and a potential for um, future technologies to be helpful in those later years.
Great. Chris, thank you so much. Is there anything else you wanted to add on this perspective?
I don't think so. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Others with comments or questions? I see a chat note from Orland Whitney at the New Mexico PRC. Says, I think to Justin, I think you and your team are well versed in opportunity costs, and this is in front of mind for your modeling teams. Orland, do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, I was just doing this is Orland with the New Mexico Public Regulation Commission. Just a brief comment. Yeah, I appreciated Justin's response. And I think, to Chris's point, I think he was talking about opportunity costs and whether those are considered through modeling runs. And I think Justin covered that well. Opportunity costs are, um, you know, the what if something bad in the future, right? So I think that is top of mind for the modeling team, and so yeah, no, I appreciated that response. Just a comment.
Great. Thanks for offering that. Justin, anything you wanted to add in response?
No, I think that Orland, Chris have got some good points on there. I think that um, one thing I would that one thing in our modeling that we're seeing that I think is important to make sure we're all cognizant of is that the modeling shows an inflection point at 2045. And um, that inflection point is based upon the policy as it's written today. Um, Now, I think that there's lots of ways that we could either smooth out that resource acquisition or allow for decisions in the future around emerging tech and things like that that are both resource selection side. There's also policy side. There's a number of ways to get at that problem or to get at a solution to those future end states that New Mexico wants, which is ultimately a lower carbon future. Um, so I think that is important to keep in mind that policy and how we're modeling this policy right now um, does have ramifications.
Great, thank you. Any other questions or comments? I'd like to specifically also call the question that Justin mentioned earlier on in the presentation, where the SPS team is planning to form an action plan that is a 4-year action plan as opposed to a 3-year, and request that permission from the commission to plan and get back on the staggered schedule amongst the 3 utilities. Are there any concerns or questions from people on the call about that proposal? I just want to give people a chance to comment on that, since it's not a huge change, but it is a change. So is there any comment on that from folks? I don't see anything in chat or hands raised. Justin, anything else you'd like to add before we do next steps and tell people what happens next?
I think that the only thing I really have to say is like, man, I really appreciate everybody having stuck through all this. I know that like it is dense stuff. that I've been talking about, and I appreciate everybody who's made the attempt to be here at multiple meetings, provide input, to provide dialogue back and forth with us. I think that that's pretty cool. That people are willing to engage in this and discuss it. It's easy for me because I mean it's pretty easy thing to nerd out on, but I just appreciate everybody taking the time. So thank you everybody who's participated.
Yeah, I'll echo my thanks. And Deb, if you'd like to please share our slide number 9, we'll let people know what's going on next. Um, Clearly, we have some follow-up to do from questions that were asked today, and we will, GridWorks and SPS will work together to get responses to those who asked those. And clearly, if there's some additional model results that come about in the next short period, SPS will be planning to post those, and we'll make sure those are accessible to people. But we really are at the point where we're closing out our detailed modeling activities. And again, thank you to those who stuck with us for this very intense period of modeling detail. Now, as we step up to a conversation back to the big picture, what does it all mean? The plan is by around August 17th, hopefully August 17th, the utility plans to share drafts of the statement of need and action plan. And we would like to ask you to consider those drafts and bring any comments, questions, suggestions, changes that you think about. Bring those to the workshop on August 26th and 27th in Carlsbad and on Zoom. But as you read those draft documents, we'd like to ask, we'll provide these questions for guiding your review. And we'd like to ask back to the purpose of these documents and the content that Kathy described at the beginning of the workshop. We'd like to know what your reactions are to the amount and types of resources that SPS identifies in that statement of need. Any questions or concerns you have about the technical characteristics of those resources, and judgment about whether the statement of need takes a broad view of the evolving system needs. Is there something missing? Is there something that should be reconsidered? That's really the focus for a review of the statement of need. And then the action plan. Are there any items that you would add, delete, or change that would be specific steps over the next 4 years to implement this longer term plan? Might you have comments regarding those actions for resource solicitation or contracting activities? And does that action plan include a status report, issuance of status report on items from the last action plan? That is one of the key elements of the action plan, is for that regular update on steps that are put forth to implement the plan. So this is just a preview, asking you perhaps to set aside a little bit of time on after August 17th and before August 26th to review those documents. And then the next slide will show what happens after that. We will post a summary and the recording to this workshop on the GridWorks website, and we will also work with SPS to post the latest set of slides, as well as any clarification or comments that were follow-ups from today. If you have questions, as always, Deborah Shields and Linda Hudgens are the recipients of your fabulous questions. And our next workshops and key activities, as I mentioned, August 17th. The plan is to get the draft statement of need and action plans out to all stakeholders, asking you to bring comments to the Carlsbad workshop. The workshop is hybrid in Carlsbad on the afternoon of the 26th and the morning of the 27th. And the focus is on the big picture again, discussing the statement of need, discussing the action plan, discussing insights that have informed those drafts, and discussing stakeholder suggestions of changes or questions to those documents. After that workshop, there will be another about a week for stakeholders to provide any written comments on statement of need and action plan. There may be some changes made during the workshop in Carlsbad, and a new version ready for you. But the idea is by September 4th will be the last opportunity for written comments on the statement of need and action plan. And then our final workshop in this process will be September 22nd in the afternoon. It will be a virtual workshop via Zoom. And it's a courtesy review by the utility of what is in the IRP, what are the main elements, where are there key components that maybe don't show up in the statement of need or action plan, but are addressed elsewhere in the IRP report. And we will also ask you all to provide feedback on this multi-month process journey that we've been on together. As the facilitators, we owe the New Mexico Public Regulation Commission a report on this process, and the commission is typically interested in any suggestions on how to improve this process for future conversations about IRP planning. So that's what's up next. I would like to just stop and see if people have any questions on what's coming next. I don't see any questions, so I want to also give the folks from SPS, Justin, Jared, Linda, any of your team, John, any final comments from the SPS utility team before we close from today?
I don't think so, Margie. I think that we are good on our side. Oh, Justin, I see you came up. I'm sorry about that.
Yeah, no, Justin Gable. I just wanted to echo your thanks to everybody here as we try and navigate customer needs. I mean, the portfolio that we're looking about here and what we're talking about here is growth for our customers, and we're doing everything we can as a company to try and respond to those load requests and try and expand our system, meet all the guidances and metrics that we are bound by, and succeed in helping and supporting our customers grow. So when customers like you show up on calls like this, the one coming on the 17th, and then the face-to-face in the Hobbs region, Carlsbad region, is extremely important. So thank you for the engagement and thank you for the support.
Excellent. All right. Kathy or Deb, is there anything administratively we need to conduct here before we give folks a little bit of time back on their calendar today?
Thanks, Margie. Nothing from me.
This is Deb. I'm okay too. Thank you, Margie.
All right. Well, thank you all. And we'll look forward to hearing from you after August 17th. You'll be hearing from us before then, and look forward to seeing many of you in Carlsbad, either on Zoom or in person in Carlsbad. Thank you, and bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.